The desert sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of red and orange. In the center of a dusty frontier town, a crowd had gathered, their faces hardened by the wind and their own cruelty. They were here for the show, and the show was a woman, an Apache woman, standing on a wooden block, her wrists raw and bleeding inside iron shackles. Her spirit was a ghost, her body a roadmap of scars that told a story no one wanted to read. She kept her eyes on the dirt, a shield against the jeers and the laughter. "She ain't worth the rope to hang her," a man yelled, spitting a brown stream of tobacco. The auctioneer, a man with a face like a dried-up riverbed, slammed his gavel down. His voice was a crack of thunder in the dying light. "$2. Who'll give me $2 for the Apache?" Silence. Then a wave of mocking laughter rolled through the crowd. A fat rancher slapped his knee. "I'd pay $2 to watch the coyotes have her." The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, heavier than any chains. She prayed for the earth to open up and swallow her whole. But even the dust beneath her feet offered no mercy. And that's when the sound cut through the noise. Boots, slow, steady, crunching on the packed earth with a rhythm that defied the chaos. The crowd parted like a dirty tide. A man walked through. He was tall, built like an old oak, with a shadow for a face hidden under the brim of a weathered hat. He was a whisper in this town, a loner who kept to the mountains, a man with no name people dared to say out loud. He stopped before the block. He didn't speak. He just reached into his coat and tossed a small leather pouch. It landed with a heavy thud. Coins, far more than were needed, spilled out across the wood. His voice was low, a rumble of rocks. "She's mine." The auctioneer stared. The crowd went dead silent. The fat rancher who'd mocked her was the first to find his voice. "You've gone mad. That's good money for that." But the cowboy didn't even look at him. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were fixed on the woman. And in them she saw something that terrified her more than any whip. It wasn't pity. It wasn't hunger. It was recognition. He stepped onto the platform, his presence sucking the air out of the square. He reached not for her, but for the heavy chain that bound her wrists. The auctioneer, startled into action, fumbled with the key and unlocked the shackles. The iron fell away. For the first time in years, her hands were her own. She braced for the inevitable pull, the rough hand that would drag her like livestock. But it never came. Instead, his calloused fingers brushed against her skin with a gentleness that felt like a brand. He was unfastening his heavy duster, the one that smelled of pine and smoke and solitude. He draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was a shock. It covered the scars, hid the shame, and for a fleeting moment, she felt safe. The crowd gasped as one. This was not the act of a man buying a slave. This was something else entirely. Trembling, she dared to lift her head and meet his gaze. And what she saw in his eyes made her heart stop cold. It was a storm, a deep, raging storm of something she couldn't name, and it was pointed directly at the crowd. He turned, his arm a firm but gentle barrier around her, and began to walk. The crowd backed away, their jeers turning to confused whispers. They walked right through the heart of their hatred, and he never broke stride. She stumbled, her body weak from starvation, but his arm was there, a pillar of iron, holding her up. With every step away from that auction block, she felt a lifetime of chains falling away behind her. The town's lights faded. The desert wind whispered secrets around them. They stopped at a small, sheltered rise of rock. He slid the pack from his shoulders and began to gather firewood with an unnerving calm. She stood frozen, wrapped in his coat, every muscle screaming with suspicion. "Men who paid for you owned you. They did not protect you." Her voice, when it finally came, was a dry, broken whisper. "Why?" He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. The new fire cast flickering shadows across a face that had seen too much. His eyes were steady as the northern star. "Because no one deserves to be left in chains." It wasn't an answer. It was a judgment. He offered her bread and a tin cup of water. She took it, her hands shaking so badly she almost spilled it. The simple food was an explosion of flavor in her empty stomach. He sat across the small fire, not speaking, not asking, not demanding. He just sat there, sharpening a long, wicked-looking knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His silence was a presence, as vast and wild as the desert around them. She watched him, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the kindness to curdle into cruelty. But it didn't. As the night deepened, a terrible thought began to form in her mind. This man, this silent stranger, wasn't just kind. He was dangerous. The way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. He wasn't a simple cowboy. He was a wolf pretending to be a sheepdog, and she was trapped in the wilderness with him. Dawn broke, and she awoke with a start. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. There was no rattle of chains, no guard's boot kicking her awake. There was only the smell of coffee and the sight of the cowboy already awake, saddling his horse. He'd laid a second blanket over her while she slept. He just nodded when he saw her eyes open. "We ride." No command, just a statement of fact. She followed, her body aching but her mind racing. They rode for days. He led them away from the main trails through hidden canyons and forgotten valleys where they were unlikely to be seen. He moved with a purpose that scared her. He wasn't just wandering. He was heading somewhere specific, and he was being careful. The further they went, the more she noticed things. The way he never slept for more than an hour at a time. The second pistol hidden in his boot. The strange, jagged scars that crisscrossed his back, visible one morning when he washed in a creek. They weren't from a whip. They were from knives. One afternoon, while they rested the horses, she saw him staring at her. Not at her face, but at her back. A chill ran down her spine. He knew something. He saw something. That night, she finally found the courage to speak again. "Who are you?" He looked up from the fire, his expression unreadable. "Just a man." "Men like you aren't just men. You're running from something, or to something." He didn't deny it. He just tossed another piece of wood on the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the night. "Maybe both." The answer hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She hadn't been saved. She had been traded, from one kind of danger to another. And this new danger was silent, patient, and armed to the teeth. His ranch wasn't a ranch, it was a fort. The small cabin was built of thick, interlocking logs, with a stone foundation and a reinforced door. The windows weren't windows. They were narrow slits, just wide enough for a rifle barrel. This wasn't a place to live. It was a place to die. He saw the look on her face. "Trouble has a way of finding me," he said by way of explanation. But that wasn't right. He wasn't waiting for trouble. He was expecting it. He set her up in a small, clean room. There was no lock on the outside of the door, but there was a heavy bar on the inside. He was giving her a way to lock him out. The gesture was so confusing, so contradictory to the fortress around them, that it only deepened her suspicion. Was this a test? The next morning, he didn't hand her a hoe. He handed her a rifle. It was heavy, oiled, and perfectly balanced. "You need to know how to use this." For the next week, he trained her. He was a patient, methodical teacher. He showed her how to load, how to aim, how to account for wind. He taught her how to reload so fast her fingers blurred. He wasn't teaching a rancher's wife to scare off coyotes. He was training a soldier for a war. One afternoon, as she hit a tin can from 50 yards for the third time in a row, she saw movement on the ridge. Riders, a half dozen of them. They were coming fast. She called out, her voice tight with panic. The cowboy, she had started calling him Jed in her mind, though he'd never offered a name, didn't flinch. He just calmly walked inside the cabin and emerged a moment later with a long-barreled rifle of his own. "Get inside," he said, his voice flat. "Bar the door." From the rifle slit, she watched them approach. It was the fat rancher from the auction, Silas, and he had brought his ranch hands, all of them armed. They reined in their horses a safe distance from the cabin, their faces a mixture of anger and fear. "Jedediah," Silas shouted, his voice cracking. So that was his name. "You got no right to be here, and you got no right to her. I'm taking what's mine." Jedediah didn't answer. He just raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. The movement was so smooth, so economical, it was terrifying. Silas and his men saw it. They shuffled their horses nervously. "She's stolen property," Silas blustered, but his conviction was gone. Jedediah's voice was quiet, but it carried across the clearing like a death rattle. "Ride away, Silas, or I'll bury you where you stand." There was no threat in his voice. It was a promise. Silas looked at his men. They looked at Jedediah's rifle. They looked at the fortified cabin. After a long, tense moment, Silas spat on the ground and yanked his horse's reins, wheeling it around. "This ain't over." "Naki," he screamed over his shoulder as they galloped away. Jedediah watched them go, his rifle never wavering. Only when they were out of sight did he lower it. He turned and looked at the cabin, at the rifle slit where he knew she was watching. He wasn't just a cowboy. He wasn't just a gunslinger. He was something far more deadly. And Silas wasn't the trouble he was expecting. He was just the appetizer. The real trouble was still coming, and she was the reason why. That night she couldn't sleep. The confrontation with Silas had shattered the fragile peace. Jedediah sat by the fire, cleaning his weapons with a focused intensity that made her skin crawl. The question burned in her throat until she couldn't hold it back anymore. "Who are they? The ones you're really waiting for?" He stopped his work, his hands going still. He looked into the flames for a long time before he answered. "The men who sold you to that auctioneer." Her blood ran cold. "Why would they come back? They got their money." "They didn't get what they really wanted," he said, his voice grim. "They made a mistake they'll kill to correct." He turned to face her then, his eyes dark with a terrible knowledge. They weren't just slavers, Nita. He used her name. She had never told it to him. He must have heard it at the auction, a name spat out like a curse. Hearing him say it now, with a strange reverence, sent a shiver through her. "They're called the Crimson Rider," he continued, "and they're not just killers. They're hunters." "Hunters? What are they hunting?" He paused, and the weight of that pause filled the entire cabin. He looked at her, at the old tunic she wore, at the faint lines visible through the thin fabric on her back. "They're hunting for a map," he said softly. "A map that's tattooed on your skin." The world tilted, the scars on her back. She had always thought they were just random marks of cruelty, a tapestry of pain from a dozen different masters. She had never imagined they meant something. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. "A map? A map to what?" "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They captured my village. They did this to me. Why?" Jedediah's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a deep, haunting regret. "They did it because they needed a map that no one would ever steal, a map they could hide in plain sight. They carved it onto the back of a slave girl they thought no one would ever look at twice. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. To turn her body, her very skin, into a secret document, to hide their greed in her suffering. A wave of nausea washed over her. All those years she had been carrying their treasure, and the price had been her life. "What does it lead to?" she asked, dreading the answer. "A legend," he said. "The lost Adam's diggings. A canyon of gold so rich it drove men mad. The Crimson Riders have been searching for it for years. They thought they finally had the key. So why sell me? Why let the map go for $2? His expression darkened. "Because the man who carved it, the only one who knew how to read it, was killed in a raid just after he finished. The rest of them just saw scars. They thought the secret was lost. They dumped you at the nearest auction block, thinking you were worthless." He took a deep breath. "But they were wrong. Someone else survived that raid. Someone who knew what to look for." Her mind was spinning, trying to piece it all together. The silent cowboy, the fortified cabin, the way he looked at her back that day by the creek. "You," she breathed. "You're the one. How, how did you know?" Jedediah finally looked away from her, staring into the dark corners of the room as if seeing ghosts. His voice was barely a whisper. "Because I designed the map." The confession hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The man who had saved her was one of them, the architect of her pain, the kindness, the protection, the rifle training. It was all a lie. He hadn't rescued her. He had repossessed his property. "You..." We're a Crimson Rider? The words were acid on her tongue. He nodded slowly, the movement full of a self-loathing that was terrifying to behold. I was their tracker, their pathfinder, the best there was. The room was shrinking, the air growing thin. She saw the rifle she had been practicing with, leaning against the wall. Before she could think, it was in her hands, the cold metal of familiar weight. She raised it, the barrel trembling as she pointed it at his chest. You lied to me, she choked out, tears of rage and betrayal blurring her vision. Everything was a lie. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just looked at her, at the rifle in her hands, and his face was filled with a profound sadness. I never lied to you, Nita. I just didn't tell you the whole truth. That's the same thing, she screamed, her finger tightening on the trigger. Why? Why would you do this? Because I left them, he said, his voice raw with ancient pain. I left them long before they found you. They came across a farmstead, a family, man, wife, two little girls. They weren't in the way. They had nothing of value. But the riders, they killed them anyway. For sport. He closed his eyes. I tried to stop them, and they left me for dead in a burning barn. That's how I got these. He gestured to the knife scars on his back. When I recovered, I swore an oath. I would hunt every last one of them down and send them to hell. His eyes opened, and they bored into hers. For 5 years, I've been a ghost on their trail. When I heard whispers of them capturing an Apache girl near the Gila River, I knew. I knew they'd found a new map maker. I rode to that auction block to find you. Not to claim the map, Nita. To erase it. To set you free. And to find the man who leads them. Cain! He spat the name like poison. He was my teacher. My friend. And he's the devil himself. He's the one who's coming. And he won't stop until he has that map, or you're both dead. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. Her world had been turned upside down, then righted, then shattered into a million pieces. The man in front of her was a monster, but he might be the only monster who could save her from the others. Her arms trembled, and slowly she lowered the gun. A fragile, terrifying truce settled between them. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were two ghosts, haunted by the same demons, bound together by a map carved in pain. Their alliance was sealed in silence. The next days were a blur of frantic preparation. Jedediah, or Jed, as she now called him, pushed her harder than ever. They didn't just practice shooting. He taught her how to set traps, how to move without a sound, how to use a knife. He was turning her into a phantom, just like him. At night, they would huddle over a makeshift table where Jed had painstakingly tried to recreate the map from memory. He would gently trace the lines on her back with a piece of charcoal, his touch respectful but clinical, and she would try to ignore the conflicting feelings it stirred inside her. It was a strange, painful intimacy, deciphering the code of her own torture. One evening, she noticed a detail he had missed, a small swirl near her shoulder blade that corresponded to a unique rock formation she remembered from her childhood. The eagle's eye, she whispered. Jed looked up, his eyes sharp. What? It's a sacred place, she explained. A landmark for my people. The map. It starts there. A grim smile touched Jed's lips. Cain is clever. He used a landmark only a native would know for sure. He'd need you to guide him. Suddenly he froze. His head snapped up, his eyes fixed on the darkening ridgeline. What is it? She asked, her own senses on high alert. Rider, he said, his voice dangerously low. He grabbed his long rifle and peered through the rifle slit. Far in the distance, a lone figure on horseback was silhouetted against the dying sun. It was a scout. The Crimson Riders had found them. It begins, Jed said. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than grim determination in his eyes. It might have been fear, not for himself, but for her. The scout was cautious. He circled the cabin from a distance, never getting too close. He was a professional, testing their defenses. He's trying to draw our fire, Jed murmured, his rifle steady, to see how many of us there are. We wait. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the valley into a deep twilight. The scout, emboldened by the darkness, started to move closer. He dismounted, using the rocks and trees for cover, creeping toward the cabin like a snake. Nita held her breath, her own rifle clutched tightly in her hands. The silence was absolute. Then a twig snapped. It was close. Too close. Now, Jed commanded. They fired at the same time. Two rifles roared as one, the sound echoing through the valley like a clap of doom. A choked cry answered them from the darkness, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. Silence returned, thicker and more menacing than before. They had won the first exchange, but it was a hollow victory. The scout's horse, now riderless, galloped back the way it came. It was a messenger, carrying the news of their location to the rest of the pack. "They'll be here by morning," Jed said, already reloading. "We need more than bullets. We need an advantage." He looked at the map, then at her. "The Eagle's Eye. Is it defensible?" She thought for a moment, picturing the jagged cliffs and narrow passes of her homeland. "It can be a fortress," she said, "or a tomb." "Good enough," he said. They didn't have much time. They packed what they could: ammunition, water, dried rations. Jed hesitated, then grabbed a small, worn leather pouch from a chest. He tucked it inside his shirt. They were about to leave when he stopped her. "There's something you need to know," he said, his face serious. "Kane, he doesn't just want the gold. He wants revenge. On me. He'll use you to get it. He will be cruel in ways you can't imagine." "I have a good imagination," she replied, her voice hard. His gaze softened. "I know." They slipped out the back of the cabin under the cover of a moonless night, leaving a lit lantern inside as a decoy. They moved quickly and silently through the wilderness, Jed leading the way, Nita following close behind. It was a hard journey, a desperate race against the dawn. They pushed themselves to the breaking point, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming. As the first pale light of morning touched the sky, they reached the foothills of the mountains she knew so well. The air grew cooler, smelling of pine and wet stone. They had made it, but as they crested the final ridge, their hearts sank. Below them, at the entrance to the very canyon they were aiming for, a campfire burned, and around it were at least a dozen figures. The Crimson Riders. The scout wasn't alone. He was part of an advance party, and they had walked right into their arms. "It's a trap," Jed hissed, pulling her back behind the rocks. They were cut off. Kane had outmaneuvered them. He had anticipated their move. Jed cursed under his breath. He knew I'd run for high ground. He looked at the terrain, his tracker's eye calculating every shadow, every possible path. "We can't go forward, and we can't go back. They'll have riders circling behind us by now." They were caught in a pincer with nowhere to run. The sun was rising, and soon their hiding place would be exposed. Nita's mind raced. This was her land. She knew secrets the invaders didn't. "There is another way," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A goat path. My grandfather showed it to me once. It is dangerous, steep, but it will take us over the ridge and into the heart of the canyon. Behind them." Jed looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I am sure." It was a climb that would have terrified a mountain goat. They moved from handhold to foothold, loose scree clattering into the abyss below them. A single misstep would mean death, but fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. Hours later, exhausted and bleeding, they pulled themselves over the final ledge. They were inside the canyon, and below them they could see the Crimson Riders' main camp, completely unaware of their presence. They had a new advantage: surprise. But their relief was short-lived. A new group of riders was entering the canyon from the main pass. At their head was a man on a jet-black stallion. He was tall and wore a long, dark coat. Even from this distance, he radiated an aura of absolute command. "Kane," Jed breathed, and the name was a curse filled with a decade of hate. But something was wrong. Kane wasn't alone. Riding beside him, looking smug and triumphant, was Silas, the rancher. And behind them a dozen grim-faced men from the town. A posse. Silas had done more than spread rumors. He had sold them out completely, leading Kane and the law right to their doorstep, convincing them Jed was a wanted man and Nita a savage murderer. Now it wasn't just the Crimson Riders they had to fight. It was the whole world. They were trapped deep behind enemy lines, with an army gathered below. Jed looked at the impossible odds, then at Nita. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fierce determination that burned in his own soul. "So be it," he said, checking the load in his rifle. "Let them come." They found a defensible position in a narrow offshoot of the canyon, a place with good cover and a clear field of fire. They were hopelessly outnumbered, but here, in the choke point, they could make every bullet count. The waiting was the worst part. They could hear the sounds from the camp below, men shouting, horses stamping, the clink of gear. They knew it was only a matter of time before Kane realized they weren't in the cabin and sent his trackers into the mountains. "When it starts," Jed said, not looking at her, "aim for the ones with the town faces first. They're not killers. They'll break." He was trying to protect her, even now, trying to spare her the hardest choices. "I will aim for whoever tries to kill me," she replied, her voice steady. The first trackers found them an hour later. They came cautiously, two of them, moving up the narrow canyon. Jed dropped the first one with a single, perfect shot to the chest. Nita took the second, her bullet catching him in the throat. The fight had begun. The canyon erupted into a symphony of destruction. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls, whining like angry hornets. The posse, led by Silas, made the first charge. They were loud, clumsy, and full of misplaced bravado. Just as Jed predicted, they weren't ready for a real fight. Faced with a storm of well-aimed fire from an unseen enemy, they faltered. Two of them went down screaming. The rest broke and ran, scrambling for cover. Silas, his face pale with terror, was the first to flee. But the Crimson Riders were different. They were veterans of 100 bloody fights. They advanced methodically, using cover, working in teams, laying down suppressing fire. They were professionals, and they were slowly, relentlessly pinning Jed and Nita down. Hour after hour, the battle raged. They fought back to back, a two-person army against the world. They were a perfect team, moving and firing in an unspoken rhythm, covering each other, anticipating each other's needs. In the heat of the battle, something shifted between them. They were no longer just allies. They were partners, forged in gunpowder and desperation. But they were losing. Their ammunition was running low. They were exhausted, dehydrated. The riders were getting closer. They could hear their voices now, shouting taunts. Then a chilling voice cut through the din. Kane's voice. It was calm, almost conversational, yet it echoed with absolute menace. "Jedediah, you can't win. I have a dozen men who would die for me. You have a $2 squaw. Give her up. Give me the map and I'll let you walk away." "He's lying," Nita gasped, reloading her rifle. "I know," Jed said, his jaw tight. "He wants me to see your face when he kills you." The psychological warfare was just as deadly as the bullets. Kane knew Jed's weaknesses. He knew how to twist the knife. The riders made another push, this time almost reaching their position. Jed was hit, a bullet grazing his arm, sending a spray of blood against the rock. He grunted in pain but never stopped firing. Nita's heart lurched, but she forced the fear down, returning fire with a cold fury. They were on the verge of being overrun. It was the end of the line. Just as the first of the riders lunged over the rocks, Nita remembered something else her grandfather had taught her. A story about the ancestors, about how they used the canyon's echoes to their advantage. She screamed. Not a scream of fear, but a war cry. A high-pitched, ululating yell that she directed at a specific point on the canyon wall opposite them. The sound hit the rock and bounced back, amplified, distorted, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Then Jed understood. He added his own voice, a deep, guttural roar. The canyon filled with a terrifying, disembodied chorus of phantom warriors. The riders, already on edge, froze in confusion. For a precious second, their attack faltered. It was the opening they needed. They scrambled from their position, deeper into the narrow passage. But it was only a temporary reprieve. Behind them, they could hear Kane, his voice cutting through the echoes, ordering his men forward. "It's a trick, you fools! Get them!" They ran, stumbling over loose rock, their lungs on fire. The passage twisted and turned, and finally opened into a small circular chamber, like a stone bowl carved into the mountain. It was a dead end. They were trapped. The footsteps of the riders were getting closer. Jed turned, his back to the wall, his pistol in his good hand, ready to make his last stand. "Nita," he said, his voice quiet, "I'm sorry for all of it." "There is nothing to be sorry for," she said, standing beside him, her own knife in her hand. "We fought." Kane appeared at the entrance to the chamber, a cruel smile on his face. "How touching," he sneered, "the fallen paladin and his savage princess. A fitting end to a pathetic story." He stepped aside and his men poured into the chamber, surrounding them. There was no escape. "The map, Jedediah," Kane said, his voice soft. "Tell me how to read it. Now. Or she dies first, slowly." Jed looked at Kane, then at Nida. He saw the defiance in her eyes, the refusal to be a victim, even at the very end. And he knew what he had to do. He slowly lowered his pistol. "You win, Kane." Kane's smile widened. "I always do." "The map isn't for gold," Jed said, his voice hollow. The riders all looked at Kane, confused. "What is he talking about, boss?" one of them asked. Kane's smile vanished. "Shut up, Jedediah." "It doesn't lead to the lost Adams diggings," Jed continued, his voice getting stronger. "That was always a lie, wasn't it, Kane? A story you told these fools to keep them loyal." He looked at the riders. "He's been playing you from the start. There is no gold." "I said shut up," Kane roared, drawing his pistol and pointing it at Jed's head. "The map leads to a grave, why," Jed said, his eyes locking with Kane's. "A hidden, unmarked grave. My wife, my daughter, the family you murdered." A collective gasp went through the riders. They looked from Jed to Kane, their loyalty wavering for the first time. Kane's face was a mask of pure fury. The secret he had held for years, the source of his twisted power over Jed, was out. "You tattooed the path to my family's resting place on this innocent woman's back." Jed's voice dripped with venom. "As the ultimate desecration, the ultimate joke. Your treasure was never gold. It was my pain." Kane recovered, his lips curling into a snarl. "And it is a treasure I will enjoy. After you're dead, I'm going to dig them up. I'm going to scatter their bones to the wolves." That's when Nita moved. While all eyes were on Jed and Kane, she had been inching toward the back wall of the chamber. She had noticed something no one else had. A series of deep grooves almost invisible in the rock. It was a hand-hewn door. She threw her entire weight against it. With a deep, grinding sound, a section of the rock wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. An escape route carved by her ancestors centuries ago. "Jed!" she screamed. For a split second, everyone was frozen in shock. It was all Jed needed. He dove for the opening as Nita disappeared inside. Kane fired, his bullet sparking off the rock where Jed's head had been a moment before. The riders, their loyalties shattered, were a moment too slow to react. Jed scrambled into the tunnel, and the heavy stone door began to swing shut behind them. Kane lunged for it, but he was too late. The door closed with a final, booming thud, sealing them in darkness and Kane and his fractured gang in the chamber of their own greed. They were safe for now. Plunged into absolute darkness, they could hear Kane's muffled screams of rage from the other side of the stone door. The tunnel was cold and smelled of damp earth and time. Nita took Jed's hand. Her touch was a steady anchor in the disorienting blackness. "This way," she whispered, her voice full of a confidence that defied the situation. "Stay close." She led him through the winding passage, one hand on the rough-hewn wall, the other holding his. She knew these tunnels. They were the secret heart of her people's land, a labyrinth no outsider could navigate. Jed stumbled, his wounded arm making him unsteady. She felt the warmth of his blood on her hand. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Just a scratch," he lied. She could hear the pain in his voice. They moved in silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the drip of water somewhere in the deep. Jed's strength was failing. He was leaning on her more and more. Finally, she saw it, a faint gray light ahead, the tunnel exit. They emerged into a hidden cove, a small pocket of green hidden high on the mountain, shielded by waterfalls and ancient trees. It was a place of impossible beauty and peace. Jed collapsed to the ground, his face pale, his shirt soaked with blood. The scratch was a deep gash that was still bleeding freely. Nita tore a strip from her tunic and expertly fashioned a tourniquet, her movements sure and practiced. She had tended to warriors' wounds before. She found a patch of moss and pressed it against the wound to stanch the bleeding. He watched her, his eyes clouded with pain, but filled with a new kind of wonder. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough. "You saved me first," she replied simply. As she worked, he reached into his shirt and pulled out the small leather pouch he had grabbed from the cabin. He pressed it into her hand. "This is for you." She opened it. Inside were two objects. One was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, a child's toy. The other was a silver locket. She opened the locket. Inside was a tiny faded portrait of a beautiful Apache woman with a smiling baby in her arms. His wife, his daughter. "Her name was Anya," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And our daughter was Morning Dove. They were my world." He had carried their memory with him through all his years of vengeance, and now he was sharing it with her. It was the ultimate act of trust, a baring of his soul that was more intimate than any touch. Tears welled in her eyes, not for his loss, but for his strength. She closed her hand around the locket, the metal warm against her skin. "We will honor them," she said. And in that hidden sanctuary, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors and his, something new was born. The hate that had driven Jed for so long began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. And the fear that had been Nita's constant companion began to melt away, replaced by a strength she never knew she possessed. But their story wasn't over. Below them, in the canyon, a war had broken out. The remnants of the Crimson Riders were fighting the town posse, greed and betrayal erupting into a bloody free-for-all. Cain, mad with rage at being cheated of his revenge, was a whirlwind of death, cutting down his own men. Suddenly, a new sound filled the canyon, a sound that made Nita's heart leap, a war horn. From the high ridges, dozens of figures appeared. Apache warriors, their faces painted for battle, armed with bows and rifles. Her people. They had been drawn by the sounds of the prolonged battle in their sacred lands. They descended on the canyon floor like a silent, deadly storm. Justice was swift and brutal. The fighting was over in minutes. The surviving outlaws and townsfolk threw down their weapons, their faces filled with terror. Cain, surrounded and out of options, fought like a cornered wolf, but a single arrow from a silent warrior found his heart. He fell without a sound, his reign of terror over. Silas the rancher was found cowering behind a rock, weeping like a child. He was dragged before the Apache war chief. Nita and Jed watched from above. "We should go down," Jed said, struggling to his feet. "They are your people." As they made their way down the mountain, a group of warriors met them. Their leader, a man with a noble, weathered face, stopped in his tracks when he saw Nita. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Nita Chi," he whispered, using a childhood name she hadn't heard in a decade. "Father," she choked out. It was her father, the chief. He had believed her to be dead, lost in the raid that had stolen her away all those years ago. He rushed forward and embraced her, tears streaming down his face. The warriors behind him let out a great cheer. The lost daughter of the chief had returned. She was home. Jed stood back, watching the reunion with a mix of joy and sorrow. He had completed his mission. He had set her free. His part in her story was over. She belonged here, with her family, with her people. Nita, still wrapped in her father's arms, looked over his shoulder and met Jed's eyes. She saw the conflict there, the noble intention to walk away and leave her to her life. She saw him preparing to become a ghost again. She pulled away from her father and walked to Jed. She took his wounded arm gently in her hands. "My people are your people now," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You are not a ghost. You have a home." Her father stepped forward, his eyes assessing Jed. He saw the wound, the weariness, but he also saw the fierce loyalty in the man's eyes and the way his daughter looked at him. He placed a hand on Jed's shoulder. "You saved my daughter. You are welcome in our lands. Always." For the first time in years, Jedediah didn't feel like a hunter or a haunted man. He felt at peace. He had spent a decade chasing vengeance, only to find redemption in the eyes of a woman he'd bought for $2. The world had tried to write their story with cruelty and shame, but together they had picked up the pen and written a new ending, one of healing, of homecoming, and of a love that had bloomed in the most barren of lands. The lonely cowboy and the woman the world had thrown away had found not just each other, but themselves. And their legend, whispered on the desert winds, was just beginning. If this story of justice and redemption touched your soul, show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing for more tales that matter. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We read every single one.